Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Luna Goldberg, and I'm the Education Manager at the Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU. Today's program is part of an ongoing series called Keys to the Collection. Every week, one of our museum docents and volunteers will guide us in taking a closer look at a narrative, character, or object in our museum collection. Joining me today is Howard Brayer, who will lead us in a program around crime on Miami Beach, specifically focusing on Meyer Lansky and the S&G Syndicate. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few notes to make sure our program runs smoothly. If you have any questions during the course of his presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box down below. Following the presentation, we'll open up the conversation to questions and comments from the audience. While we encourage your participation, please also make sure that your microphone is muted during the conversation. Lastly, I'd like to share with you a little context about the museum. The Jewish Museum of Florida, FIU, is a historic and cultural institution affiliated with Florida International University. This year, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary as a museum, though our building precedes us, having been built in the 1920s and 30s. Through our core and traveling exhibitions, our museum is dedicated to telling the story of more than 250 years of Florida Jewish history, arts, and culture. While our doors are currently closed, we invite you to visit our website to learn more about our virtual programs, lectures, and exhibition. Without further ado, please welcome Howard Brayer.
Thank you very much, Luna. As Luna said, today's presentation focuses on Jewish crime in South Florida, or certain aspects of it. But before we get into that, just a little bit about myself and my volunteer activities at the museum. I moved to Miami Beach from Washington, D.C. At the very end of 2011. And when I arrived in Miami Beach, I had just retired from the federal government in Washington, D.C. When I came to Miami Beach, I was looking for volunteer things to do. I knew that the Jewish Museum existed from prior visits to Miami Beach. So I thought, oh, there's a good chance that the museum uses volunteers. So just a couple of weeks after my arrival, I went down to the museum, and sure enough, they do use volunteers as docents. So probably within about 2 or 3 weeks, I became a docent talking to people inside the museum. And I enjoyed that very much. And about 6 months later, I had the idea of doing a Jewish walking tours of the area around the museum. So I developed a tour over the next several months and started doing that tour about 6 months later. So at the beginning, it was the beginning of 2013. And I enjoyed being both a docent inside the museum and being a walking tour guide very much, especially the walking tour part, I think. Miami Beach used to be very heavily Jewish. That's not the case anymore. So I feel like, and it's not readily apparent that it was if you just walk around. So a lot of people who come on the tours already know that, but some really don't. So I think it's an education experience for those people. And I especially like it. Some people come on the tour who grew up in Miami Beach when it was heavily Jewish, so it brings back old memories for them. So, okay, that was a little bit about myself and my volunteering there. So now on to today's program. So there's two topics related. First, again, Meyer Lansky. Probably most of the people watching know about Meyer Lansky. He was a major organized crime figure in the nation, actually, in the early and mid 20th century. He became the Jewish criminal most associated with South Florida and the Miami area. He was a member of Beth Jacob Synagogue. Beth Jacob Synagogue is now the home of the Jewish Museum of Florida, so that's the connection to the museum. The second topic is less well known. It's Miami Beach's S&G Gambling Syndicate. It was founded by 5 Miami Beach Jewish men in the 1940s, and they came to dominate illegal bookmaking in that city in the late 1940s. Before we get to Lansky, just a little background on organized crime and gambling in South Florida in general. Organized crime figures first became involved in operations in South Florida in 1920, the start of prohibition, illegal alcohol in America. Organized crime figures were involved in the rum running trade. Alcohol was still legal in nearby Bahamas and Caribbean islands, so organized crime figures were involved in running the alcohol from ships offshore onto the mainland of Florida. And then often the alcohol was shipped north under cover of fruit or vegetables on trucks or trains. And during Prohibition, which lasted until 1933, even though it was illegal, it was easily, in Miami and Miami Beach, it was easy to find alcohol to drink. Over the next several decades, organized crime figures came to South Florida for 2 main reasons. One reason was really the same as most other people came who weren't involved in criminal activities, as a vacation playground. The second reason was to set up large illegal gambling operations. And interestingly, South Florida was seen as neutral territory by the various organized crime families. For the most part, they coexisted peacefully, as opposed to battles for supremacy in other cities around the nation. In the 1930s, gambling, both legal and illegal, became a major attraction in South Florida. Oh, you know what? I didn't share my screen here. We forgot. Sorry about that. Okay, there you see Lansky and the S&G. We'll talk more about them. Here's a picture of Rum Runners on their boat. Okay, and here's where we are. The state passed a law in 1931 legalizing racetrack betting. Hialeah Racetrack, which opened in 1932, became such an immediate success that its annual racing dates of January 1st until March 15th of each year became the unofficial tourist season in South Florida. Slot machines were legalized, but only for a brief time, from the beginning until the end of 1935, but they proliferated even after their banishment, as the government was loath to crack down on such a lucrative enterprise, which brought a lot of money to Miami Beach. Illegal bookmaking, that's the off-track betting on horse races, became widespread. And pictured here is a bookie working the phones in the 1940s. So that's a little bit of a general background. Here's a picture of one of the 77 stained glass windows in the Jewish Museum of Florida. It was donated by none other than Meyer Lansky. You can see his name there. It's just it can be seen just a few steps from the entrance of the museum. And very close to that window is an adjacent display in the museum, providing a brief overview of Lansky's life in the shape of a roulette wheel. Meyer Lansky was born as Meyer Suko Lansky in Grodno, Russia, which is now part of Belarus, in 1902. His family emigrated to the United States after suffering at the hands of anti-Jewish pogroms in 1911, settling on New York's Lower East Side. Lansky met Bugsy Siegel, another famous mobster, when they were teenagers. They formed the Bugs Meyer gang and became involved in gambling and bootlegging during Prohibition. Eventually, they became involved with Charles Lucky Luciano, who's pictured here, a member of the Italian mafia, and with whom they formed a lasting partnership. Luciano, with Lansky's assistance, formed a national crime syndicate. As Lansky's influence grew, he became one of the mafia's major bankers, earning the nickname the mob's accountant. He managed mafia funds and financed major endeavors. Just a bit about Lansky's private life. He married Anna Citron in 1929, and they had 3 children. They're pictured here on the left. Their daughter, Sandra, published a tell-all memoir entitled Daughter of the King, Growing Up in Gangland in 2014. Lansky's marriage to Anna was not a happy one, and they got divorced in 1947. Just a year later, in 1948, Lansky married Thelma Schwartz. Her nickname was Teddy, and he remained married to her until his death. By 1936, Lansky had established gambling operations in Florida, New Orleans, and Cuba, and later expanding to Las Vegas. These operations were very successful, and they were found on 2 innovations. First, he used his technical expertise to manage them based on his knowledge of the true mathematical odds that would bring the house the most profits. And second, through bribes, he used his mob connections to ensure the physical and legal security of the establishments, both from other crime figures and law enforcement officials. He also came to an agreement with the Cuban dictator, Fulgencio Batista. In exchange for monetary kickbacks, Batista agreed to give Lansky and his associates control of Havana's racetracks and casinos. His gambling operations were run with great integrity. They weren't so-called clip joints where gamblers were unsure whether or not the games were rigged against them. They were actually honest. They were called carpet joints because they were so fancy they had carpeting on the floor as opposed to the less fancy sawdust joints. To protect himself from the type of prosecution that sent Al Capone to prison for income tax evasion, Lansky transferred his illegal earnings to a Swiss bank account where they were anonymous. Lansky eventually bought an offshore bank which he used to launder money through a network of shell and holding companies. Over time, Lansky became so synonymous with South Florida gambling that a stretch of Hallandale was referred to as Lansky Land. I really like that name. He also reputedly had an interest in a group of highly profitable Miami Beach hotels, including the Deauville, Sans Souci, Saxony, and Eden Rock. In addition to these luxurious properties, he was believed to secretly control a group of 19 motels on well-known Motel Row in Sunny Isles. If you're not familiar where all the tall buildings are in Sunny Isles, used to be just one after another of small motels. They catered primarily to a middle-class clientele. His daily routine was to often walk his dog on Collins Avenue in Miami Beach, have breakfast at Wolfie's Deli, and use the second floor card room of the Singapore Hotel, pictured here in Bal Harbor, as his base of operations. A little bit about Lansky and his connection to Judaism. His grandparents were traditional religious Jews. After emigrating to the United States, Lansky attended a Jewish school, which was not unusual for the time, and he was bar mitzvahed. Later in life, he became very secular as far as religion went, but he always kept a strong ethnic and cultural Jewish identity. Throughout his life, most of his friends and business associates were Jewish. He provided support for synagogues and Jewish charities and for the Haganah, which was the Jewish Defense Force in pre-state Israel. Beginning in the 1930s, Lansky and his associates stepped outside of their usual criminal activities to break up rallies held by pro-Nazi German-American Bund groups. He recalled a particular rally in Yorkville, a German neighborhood in Manhattan, that he and 14 others disrupted. And this is a direct quote. The stage was decorated with a swastika and a picture of Adolf Hitler. The speakers started ranting. There were only 15 of us, but we went into action. We threw some of them out the windows. Most of the Nazis panicked and ran out. We chased them and beat them up. We wanted to show them that Jews would not always sit back and accept insults. This period of Lansky's life is portrayed in the novel The Devil Himself by Eric Desenhall. After World War II, much of Lansky's time was focused on his operations in Cuba. During a 1947 meeting of mafia kingpins there, Lansky allegedly made the famous comment that the American mafia was bigger than United States Steel, which was one of the biggest companies in the world at the time. The quote was also used by the fictional character Hyman Roth in the film The Godfather Part 2, and Lansky is widely viewed as the inspiration for the Roth character. However, after the 1959 Cuban Revolution and the rise to power of Fidel Castro, the island's casinos were nationalized and gambling was outlawed. This wiped out much of Lansky's assets and revenues. It's highly disputed how much he actually lost. The highest figure I found was $170 million. In 1970, Lansky was charged with income tax evasion. He fled to Israel in the hopes that the law of return, which states that any Jew can settle there, would enable him to escape prosecution. And you could see him with the old city of Jerusalem in the background here. However, the law excludes those with criminal pasts, and Lansky was deported back to the United States. In 1973, he was acquitted of income tax evasion, and other charges were dropped because of his poor health. In his later years, Lansky lived a low-profile life in Miami Beach. He had a condo in the Imperial House, which is on the 5200 block of Collins Avenue. He dressed like the average grandfather, walked his dog every morning, and portrayed himself as a harmless retiree. He died of lung cancer in Miami Beach's Mount Sinai Hospital in 1983. There were rumors at the time that he left behind a fortune of $300 million, but no trace of it was ever found. And his family claimed that his net worth was only in the tens of thousands of dollars. Lansky was buried at Mount Nebo Cemetery in West Miami. His funeral was presided over by Rabbi Shmaryahu Swirsky, who said he knew Lansky as a friend and spiritual counselor at Beth Jacob Synagogue for 7 years. In his brief eulogy, the rabbi said the cancer that claimed Lansky's life racked him with pain. There's a rabbinic dictum that pain cleanses a human being. The pain he suffered cleansed him. Pain was etched all over his face. So moving on to the second sort of related topic, the S&G Gambling Syndicate. And pictured here are the 5 founders of the S&G Gambling Syndicate. None of them are well known today, but I'll give you their names. It was Jules Levitt, Ben Cohn, Edward Rosenbaum, Harold Salvi, and Leo Levitt. No one knows for sure what the initials S&G stood for, but it may have been for stop and go. Often the Miami Beach government turned a blind eye to the illegal activities because it brought a lot of money into the city. When there was an occasional crackdown, operations had to stop. When the authorities again looked the other way, they could go on. By 1948, they controlled bookmaking operations in about 200 hotels and other locations and grossed over $26 million in bets, quite a large sum for that time. And there's an anecdote that in the late 1940s, one could walk up and down Collins Avenue in Miami Beach and continuously hear horse racing results from radios playing in hotel windows along the way. As I said, most of these operations were in hotels, if the hotel had a swimming pool, often in a cabana by the pool or in a small room off the main lobby. This is a picture of the lobby of the Essex House Hotel in Miami Beach. And you can see the 3 red arrows there. So they would put these arrows in the floor indicating the gambling, where the gambling was taking place. It was in that small room that's now a bar. So people, when they came in, would not have to ask the hotel clerk where the gambling was. Much of the illegal gambling ended after a government crackdown in the early 1950s. A key person in that crackdown was the man pictured here, Melvin Richard. He was one of the first Jewish lawyers to practice in Miami Beach. He arrived in Miami Beach in the early 1930s when his family moved here from Brooklyn. In 1935, he opened a law office in the city. Soon after that, he became a municipal judge, and he was known as incorruptible when many politicians could be bought off. He served in the Navy during World War II, and when he returned home, he found the city filled with corruption. Specifically the S&G Gambling Syndicate, and he made it his goal to rid the city of the illegal gambling. The S&G tried many times to bribe Richard, offering him as much as $200,000 to find some other issues to focus on. When he turned down the payoffs, the syndicate volunteered to help him relocate to North Carolina. Why North Carolina? I have no idea. When that strategy also failed, the syndicate spent $1 million on a voter recall to have Richard removed from his office. The issue of whether a recall would be allowed eventually reached the Florida Supreme Court, and the recall initiative was squashed. Richard got a big break in 1950 when he caught the ear of a U.S. Senator, Estes Kefauver of Tennessee. Kefauver headed a special Senate committee investigating crime in America. On the left, he's the man in the middle of the 3 people there. Kefauver agreed to come to Miami to investigate the S&G Gambling Syndicate, and he came armed with a new weapon, television. His hearings were televised. He called the S&G Miami's public enemy number 1. The people who did not own a TV at the time, and there were many because TV was still new in 1950, could go to movie theaters and watch for free in the movie theater. So that's what you see in the other picture here. Eventually, 2 of the 5 S&G members were convicted of wrongdoing. However, citing the lax enforcement of gambling laws, the judge gave them very light sentences. A $5,000 fine for one, a $4,000 fine for the other, suspended 2-year prison terms for both, and also 3 years on probation for both. But that pretty much put an end to most, though not all, of the illegal gambling in Miami Beach. Melvin Richard continued his career and went on to become the mayor of Miami Beach in the early 1960s. So that's it for the formal